The gavel echoed like a gunshot in the velvet-draped room. For $50 million, Vivian's stepfather had just sold her soul, her body, and her future. But the man who won the bid wasn't just a reclusive billionaire. He was a predator who had stalked the night for 5 centuries. The crimson silk of Vivian Monroe's dress felt less like haute couture and more like a beautifully tailored noose. She stood in the oppressive, dimly lit antechamber of the St. James Syndicate, a private, ultra-exclusive gentlemen's club hidden beneath the sprawling streets of Manhattan. The air smelled heavy with the scent of aged mahogany, expensive cigars, and a metallic undertone she couldn't quite identify. Vivienne was 22, freshly graduated with a degree in art history, and completely oblivious to the supernatural underbelly of the elite circles her family danced in. Her mother, Catherine, had died under sudden, mysterious circumstances just a year prior. Since then, her stepfather, Richard Gallagher, had unraveled. Richard was a hedge fund manager whose public image was one of calculating brilliance, but behind closed doors, he was a slave to underground gambling rings and illicit investments. He owed tens of millions to the wrong kinds of people. People who didn't just break legs, but erased entire bloodlines. "Just smile, Vivi," Richard had told her in the town car on the way here, his hands trembling as he adjusted his custom Tom Ford tie. "It's a networking gala. There are men in this room who can wipe my slate clean. I just need you to be charming. Be the beautiful daughter. That's all." It was a lie. As the heavy oak doors swung open, Vivian was ushered not into a ballroom filled with polite conversation and champagne, but into a theater-like auditorium. The audience was composed of roughly 50 men and a few women, all seated in plush, tired seating. They wore bespoke suits and vintage gowns, their faces obscured by the shadows of the room. At the center of the floor was a raised, circular velvet podium. A tall man with a silver-tipped cane and a tailored charcoal suit stepped onto the podium. "Welcome, esteemed patrons. Tonight we have a highly unique offering to settle a rather substantial debt incurred by Mr. Richard Gallagher." Panic seized Vivian's throat. She turned to look at Richard, but 2 massive men in dark suits had already stepped between them, effectively boxing her in. "Richard, what is going on?" Vivian hissed, her voice trembling. Richard wouldn't look at her. He stared at the floor, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "I'm sorry, Vivi. It was the only way. They were going to kill me." Before she could scream, a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder, forcing her forward toward the illuminated podium. The auctioneer, a man they called Balthazar, smiled, though it didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. "Miss Vivian Monroe," Balthazar announced to the room, his voice amplifying without a microphone. 22 years of age, perfect health, untouched by the corruption of our world. But most importantly, she possesses the Catherine Monroe lineage, a bloodline of unparalleled purity, dormant but undeniable. Vivian's heart hammered violently against her ribs. Lineage? Bloodline? What were they talking about? She looked out into the crowd. The people staring back at her didn't look like normal investors. Their eyes seemed to catch the dim lighting in unnatural ways, flashes of gold, crimson, and predatory silver. "We shall start the bidding at 10 million, Balthazar declared. "Balthazar." 15, a voice called out immediately from the second row. It was Viktor Volkov, a notorious Russian shipping magnate whose temper was legendary in the tabloids. As he leaned forward, Vivian swore she saw his teeth elongate, just slightly, catching the light. 20, another voice chimed in. Vivian stood frozen, paralyzed by the sheer absurdity and terror of the moment. She was being sold. Her own stepfather had brought her here to pay off his gambling debts by auctioning her like a piece of livestock to billionaires. 25, Volkov growled, his eyes locked onto her neck. Vivian felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. 30 million. The bids climbed with dizzying speed. The men in the room weren't just looking at her with lust. They were looking at her with an insatiable, physical hunger. 40 million, Volkov spat, slamming his hand on the armrest of his chair. The wood cracked under his grip. I will have the Monroe girl. Her blood belongs to the Volkov pack. Pack? Vivian's mind spun. Balthazar raised his gavel. 40 million to Mr. Volkov. Going once. Going 50 million. The voice didn't boom, nor was it shouted. It was a low, silken baritone that cut through the heavy silence of the room like a freshly sharpened blade. The temperature in the auditorium seemed to plummet the moment the words were spoken. Every head in the room turned toward the back of the theater. Stepping out of the shadows was a man who looked like he had been carved from marble and shadow. He was impeccably dressed in a midnight blue suit, no tie, his collar open to reveal a throat and jawline of striking, masculine perfection. His hair was dark and slightly unkempt, framing a face that was dangerously handsome. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from Vivian's lungs. They were a piercing, iridescent, icy blue, ancient and entirely devoid of human warmth. Damien Ashford. Even Vivian, disconnected from the elite circles, recognized the name. Damien Ashford was a ghost in the financial world. He owned half the real estate in Manhattan, countless pharmaceutical companies, and private military contractors, yet he had never given an interview, never been photographed clearly, and never attended public galas. 50 million, Balthazar stuttered, losing his composed demeanor for the first time. Mr. Ashford, we are honored by your presence. Volkov stood up, his massive chest heaving. Ashford, this is a syndicate auction, not one of your council decrees. You cannot just waltz in here. Damien didn't even look at the Russian. He kept his icy gaze locked entirely on Vivian. She felt like a mouse caught in the sights of a hawk. 50 million, Damien repeated, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it echoed perfectly in the silent room. And if anyone in this room bids another dime, I will personally ensure their entire bloodline is extinguished before the sun rises. The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Volkov bared his teeth, a low growl literally vibrating in his chest, but he slowly, reluctantly, sat back down. No one dared challenge the king. Balthazar swallowed hard. 50 million. Sold. To Damien Ashford. The gavel slammed down. Damien didn't wait for Balthazar to finish the closing remarks. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps making zero sound against the hardwood floor. When he reached the podium, the two large guards instinctively stepped back, lowering their heads in a gesture of pure submission. Damien stood before Vivian. Up close, he smelled of cedar wood, expensive bourbon, and winter air. He reached out, his long, pale fingers gently trailing along the line of her jaw. His skin was freezing cold. You're shaking, little bird, he murmured. Please, Vivian whispered, a single tear escaping her eye. Don't do this. Damien's thumb brushed the tear away. Your stepfather sold you to monsters, Vivian. I just bought the cage. He turned his head slightly toward Richard, who was shrinking into the shadows of the room. The debt is paid, Gallagher. If I ever see your face in my city again, I will tear your heart from your chest. Literally. Without another word, Damien took Vivian's arm. His grip was entirely inescapable, like a vice made of steel. Walk with me, Miss Monroe. We have a long drive ahead of us. The ride to the Hudson Valley was conducted in a suffocating silence. Vivian sat in the back of the armored Maybach, pressing herself as far into the corner of the leather seat as physically possible. Across from her sat Damien Ashford. He didn't look at her. His attention instead focused on a tablet in his hands, scrolling through what looked like stock reports and encrypted messages. In the driver's seat was a man Damien had called Alistair. He drove with mechanical precision, his eyes periodically darting to the rearview mirror to check on Vivian. "Where are you taking me?" Vivian finally asked, her voice cracking the silence. She hated how weak she sounded. Damien didn't look up from his screen. "To my estate. It is the only place within 500 miles where Viktor Volkov and his mutts cannot reach you." "Mutts?" Vivian asked, confusion warring with her terror. He growled at you, back there, and you threatened to extinguish his bloodline. What is going on? What are you people?" Damien sighed, finally setting the tablet down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. In the passing streetlights, his eyes caught a predatory silver gleam. "Tell me, Vivian, what did your mother tell you about your family history?" "Nothing," she stammered. "We're normal. We're just normal people." Catherine Monroe was many things. But she was not normal, Damien said quietly. She was a sanguine herald, a rare genetic mutation in human blood that acts as a super serum for my kind. A vampire who drinks from a herald doesn't just feed. They gain immunity to the sun. They gain strength that rivals the ancient elders. Your mother kept you hidden, masked your scent with human mundanity. But when she died, Richard found her journals. He realized what you were. He realized he was sitting on a $50 million lottery ticket. Vivian stared at him. A hysterical laugh bubbled in her throat, but she choked it down. "Vampires? You're telling me you are a vampire, and Volkov is, what, a werewolf? Do not mock what you do not understand," Damien warned, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with an ancient authority that made every hair on Vivian's arms stand up. "Our world has existed in the shadows for millennia. We control the banks, the governments, the wars. And right now, the only reason you are not being ripped apart in a Russian safe house is because I bought you." "Then let me go," she challenged, a sudden spike of anger replacing her fear. "If you're so noble, open the door and let me go." Damien smiled. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing. "If I let you out on this highway, you would be dead or captured within 10 minutes. You carry the scent of a herald, Vivian. You are a beacon in the dark to every starving predator on the eastern seaboard. You belong to me now, not as a slave, but as my ward and my consort." "Consort?" she gasped. "To prevent the Vampire Council from demanding I share your blood, I must claim you legally and politically within our society. You will live in my home. You will wear my crest. You will play the role of my beloved." Before she could process the insanity of his words, the Maybach slowed, turning off the winding mountain road and passing through massive wrought-iron gates adorned with a wolf and a raven. The car rolled up a long, gravel driveway until it stopped in front of a sprawling, Gothic-style mansion built directly into the side of a cliff. It was beautiful, terrifying, and completely isolated. Alistair opened her door. Vivian stepped out into the freezing night air, the wind whipping the thin silk of her red dress around her legs. Damien led her inside. The interior of the estate was surprisingly modern. Soaring glass windows overlooking the valley, minimalist black marble floors, and walls lined with ancient texts and Renaissance art. "Alistair will show you to your quarters," Damien said, shrugging off his suit jacket. "Do not try to run. The woods are heavily guarded, and the things that patrol them at night do not take prisoners. He turned to walk away, but Vivian's desperation took over. She lunged forward, grabbing his forearm. "Wait, you spent $50 million on me. You said you didn't buy me for blood, but you're a vampire. What do you actually want from me?" Damien froze. He looked down at her hand on his arm. Slowly, he turned back to face her. The space between them evaporated. He stepped into her personal space, his towering frame forcing her to tilt her head back to look at him. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could feel the unnatural cold radiating from his skin, yet his breath against her neck sent a strange, electric heat pooling in her stomach. "What do I want from you?" he whispered, his lips grazing the shell of her ear. He inhaled deeply, his chest expanding as he took in her scent. A low, agonizing groan vibrated in his throat. "I want to tear that dress off you. I want to sink my teeth into your collarbone and drink until I forget the last 500 years. I want to ruin you, Vivian," she gasped, her fingers digging into his shirt. She should be terrified. She was terrified. But there was a dark, magnetic pull between them, a chemical reaction she couldn't explain. Damien pulled back abruptly, his eyes entirely black, the icy blue completely swallowed by his dilated pupils. He was fighting for control, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like the bone might snap. "But I won't," he commanded, more to himself than to her. He took a sharp step back, the cold aristocrat returning to his features. "You are safe here, Miss Monroe, so long as you follow my rules. Do not leave the estate. Do not invite anyone inside. And most importantly, do not ever tempt me like that again, because my self-control has its limits." He turned and vanished into the shadows of the hallway, leaving Vivian standing alone in the grand foyer, her heart racing, her blood singing, and her mind racing with the realization that she was entirely, hopelessly, trapped in the den of the Vampire King. For 3 weeks, the Ashford estate in the Hudson Valley became Vivian's entire universe. It was a gilded cage constructed of imported Italian marble, original Caravaggio paintings, and sweeping views of the mist-shrouded Appalachian foothills. Her wardrobe had been completely replaced overnight with garments sourced directly from Bergdorf Goodman and private ateliers in Paris, cashmere sweaters, silk loungewear, and evening gowns that cost more than her college tuition. Yet the isolation was deafening. Damien Ashford was a phantom in his own home. He spent his days in a lightless, subterranean wing of the estate, managing his empire. At night, he would emerge, dressed impeccably in bespoke Tom Ford or Brioni suits, an antique Patek Philippe Grand Complications watch gleaming on his wrist. They shared dinner every evening at opposite ends of a mahogany table long enough to seat 20. He was fiercely protective, yet entirely detached. He asked her about her art history studies, engaged her in debates about Renaissance architecture, and ensured her glass of Chateau Margaux was never empty. But he never touched her. Not since that first night in the foyer. The restraint he exhibited was so rigid, it felt like a physical wall between them. "You look exhausted," Damien noted one Tuesday evening, his voice slicing through the quiet clinking of silverware. Vivian pushed her plate of seared scallops away. "It's hard to sleep when you know there's a Russian werewolf trying to figure out how to bypass the perimeter security." Damien's lips twitched in the faintest ghost of a smile. "Viktor Volkov is a brute, but he is not a strategist. He relies on brute force. The security system surrounding this property was designed by former engineers from Palantir and fortified by spellweavers older than the Magna Carta. He cannot simply walk through the front door." "That doesn't mean he isn't trying," Vivian retorted, her frustration bubbling over. "I read the Financial Times in your library today. Volkov's front company, VTech Logistics, just acquired a controlling stake in a private military contractor, Academy veterans. He's not sending wolves, Damien. He's buying a human army." Damien paused, his icy blue eyes narrowing slightly. For the first time, he looked genuinely impressed. "You have been investigating my rivals." "I am locked in a house with a 500-year-old vampire," Vivian said, standing up from the table. "I prefer to know who is trying to kill me, and who is supposed to be keeping me alive." Before Damien could respond, the heavy oak doors of the dining room burst open. Alistair stood in the threshold, his usually pristine suit rumpled, a Heckler & Koch MP5 submachine gun slung across his chest. Blood, dark and viscous, dripped from his temple. "Sir," Alistair gasped, his eyes darting to Vivian. "The perimeter has been breached. They bypassed the wards." Damien stood up, moving with a speed that Vivian's human eyes could barely track. 1 second he was at the head of the table, the next he was standing directly in front of Alistair. "How? The wards require ancient blood to break." "Volkov didn't use his pack," Alistair said, gripping his weapon. "He used human mercenaries. They drove armored tactical vehicles straight through the eastern gates. They're carrying incendiary rounds and white phosphorus grenades. The wards don't register humans as a supernatural threat." A violent tremor shook the estate as an explosion detonated somewhere in the West Wing. The crystal chandelier above the dining table swayed violently, raining glass down onto the floor. Damien's demeanor shifted entirely. The aristocratic billionaire vanished. In his place stood an apex predator, his jaw locked, his irises bleeding from icy blue into a terrifying, bottomless black. The air in the room dropped 20 degrees, a localized winter forming around his fury. He turned to Vivian, grabbing her shoulders. His grip was bruising, desperate. "Listen to me very carefully. Alistair is taking you to the panic room beneath the wine cellar. The door is forged from titanium and lined with lead. You do not open it. Not for me, not for Alistair. Only when the sun rises." "Damien, you can't fight an army of mercenaries alone." Vivian screamed over the sound of automatic gunfire echoing down the western corridors. "I have survived plagues, inquisitions, and 2 world wars, little bird," Damien snarled softly, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "A few Russian thugs with rifles are nothing but target practice." He released her and sprinted into the hallway, moving as a blur of shadow and lethal intent. Alistair grabbed Vivian's hand, pulling her toward the kitchen corridors. They ran through the labyrinthine servant passages, the sound of tearing metal and men screaming echoing behind them. It didn't sound like a gunfight. It sounded like a massacre. As they reached the heavy iron door of the cellar, a massive explosion rocked the floorboards directly above them. The ceiling fractured, and a shower of debris and dust collapsed downward. "Go!" Alistair shoved her toward the stairs, turning to face the corridor as heavy combat boots thudded in their direction. Vivian stumbled down the stone steps, her heart hammering against her ribs. But as she reached the bottom, a terrifying realization washed over her. The gunfire had stopped. The screams had stopped. There was only a heavy, suffocating silence. Against every instinct of self-preservation, she didn't open the panic room door. She crept back up the stairs, peering through the settling dust of the hallway. In the center of the grand foyer, surrounded by the mangled bodies of a dozen heavily armed mercenaries, was Damien. He was on his knees, his tailored suit shredded. A silver-laced phosphorus grenade had detonated at point-blank range. Half of his torso was charred, the skin trying to knit itself back together, but sizzling and failing as the silver poisoned his regenerative cells. Standing 10 feet away, stepping casually over a dead mercenary, was Viktor Volkov. He was in his human form, wearing a heavy tactical coat, carrying a massive custom-built shotgun. "You always were too arrogant, Ashford," Volkov rumbled, leveling the barrel at Damien's head. "Silver might not kill an ancient like you immediately, but it slows you down enough for me to take what is mine." Volkov's eyes locked onto the cellar doorway. He saw Vivian. A sickening, victorious grin spread across his face. "Ah, there is the little herald." "Run, Vivian," Damien choked out, coughing up a mouthful of blackened blood. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out, the silver poisoning entirely compromising his nervous system. "I don't think she's going anywhere," Volkov laughed, racking a shell into the chamber of his shotgun. He began walking toward the cellar doors. "Your stepfather told me all about your little inheritance, Vivian. With your blood, my pack won't just rule the syndicate. We'll rule the sun. I'm going to bleed you dry, drop by drop." Vivian backed away, her hands trembling. She looked at Volkov, then at Damien, who was bleeding out on the marble floor. He had spent $50 million to save her. He had locked her in a cage, yes, but he had never laid a hand on her. He had treated her with a strange, tragic reverence. She wasn't going to let him die. Instead of running into the panic room, Vivian sprinted across the foyer. She slid to her knees on the blood-slicked marble right beside Damien, placing herself squarely between him and Volkov's shotgun. Volkov paused, his grin faltering. "Move, girl, or I'll blow a hole through you and scrape your blood off the floor." "Vivian, what are you doing?" Damien gasped, his eyes wide with horror as he looked up at her. "Get away." "You said my blood is a super serum," Vivian whispered fiercely, her hands framing his cold, ash-covered face. "You said it gives you the strength of the ancients." Damien's black eyes widened, realizing what she was offering. "No, I won't turn you into a cattle. I won't take it by force." "You aren't taking it," she said, her voice steadying. She tilted her head to the side, exposing the pale, unbroken skin of her neck, offering the pulsing vein directly to his mouth. "I am giving it to you. Drink, Damien. Drink and kill him." Volkov realized what was happening a second too late. He raised the shotgun and roared, pulling the trigger. But Damien moved. Fueled by instinct and proximity to the herald's blood, Damien surged upward, pulling Vivian flush against his chest. He buried his face in her neck, his elongated fangs piercing her skin just as the buckshot tore through the space where her head had been a fraction of a second before. The bite was not painful. It was a sudden, sharp pinch followed immediately by a rush of overwhelming, euphoric heat. Vivian gasped, her fingers tangling in Damien's dark hair as he drank. It felt as though a tether of liquid fire had been struck between their souls. She could feel his exhaustion, his ancient loneliness, and now, his rapidly exploding power. Damien drank for only 3 seconds, but for a sanguine herald, 3 seconds was a tidal wave of supernatural energy. He pulled back, his eyes no longer black, but glowing with a terrifying, incandescent silver light. The charred, poisoned wounds on his torso hissed, smoking violently before knitting together flawlessly in a matter of seconds. The silver within his veins was forcibly expelled, rejected by the sheer potency of Vivian's bloodline. Volkov backed up, his face draining of color. The shotgun trembled in his hands. Impossible. Damien stood up. He didn't look like a wounded billionaire anymore. He looked like a god of war. "You came into my home," Damien whispered, his voice echoing from every corner of the foyer simultaneously. "You brought fire to my sanctuary, and you threatened my consort." Volkov shifted, his bones cracking and snapping as he desperately tried to force his werewolf transformation to fight back. But Damien didn't give him the time. In a blur of motion, Damien closed the 10-foot gap. He didn't use weapons. He slammed his hand directly into Volkov's chest, his fingers piercing the thick tactical armor and the werewolf's ribcage with sickening ease. Volkov choked, blood spilling over his lips, his eyes wide in shock. "Your pack is leaderless," Damien hissed into the Russian's ear, "and your bloodline is extinguished." Damien ripped his hand backward. Volkov collapsed to the floor, lifeless, a gaping hole where his heart used to be. The estate fell utterly silent, save for the crackling of a small fire burning in the west wing. Damien stood over the body for a long moment, chest heaving, the silver glow slowly fading from his eyes, replaced once again by that piercing icy blue. He turned slowly toward Vivian. She was still sitting on the floor, pressing a hand to her bleeding neck, her heart racing not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the bond they had just forged. He walked over to her, dropping to his knees. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his ruined suit jacket and gently pressed it against the puncture wounds on her neck. His hands, previously freezing, now felt warm, alive. "You gave it to me," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "You had the chance to run, to let me die, and you gave me your blood." "You saved me at the auction," Vivian replied softly, looking up into his eyes. "We're even." Damien leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "We will never be even, Vivian. When a vampire drinks willingly given blood from a herald, it isn't just a physical transaction. It is a soul binding. You are not my prisoner anymore. You are my equal, the queen of the syndicate." Vivian's breath hitched. She looked around the ruined foyer, at the bodies, at the blood, and finally, at the terrifying, beautiful man kneeling before her. She had been auctioned as property, meant to be a victim in a world of monsters. Instead, she had just crowned the king. "Then I suppose we have a mess to clean up," she whispered, her hand rising to cup his jaw. Damien smiled, a true, warm smile that reached his eyes. He lifted her effortlessly into his arms, carrying her away from the carnage and into the shadows of their new empire. The auction was over, but their reign had just begun. Did Vivian make the right choice, or has she just traded one gilded cage for an empire of shadows? If you were in her shoes, would you have given Damien your blood, or left him to his fate? Let us know in the comments below. If you loved this dark, twisted romance, smash that like button, share it with your fellow dark romance addicts, and hit subscribe for more dangerously addictive audio stories. Your next obsession is waiting.